In this lesson, I want to take a quick break from VS Code and our project to talk about ARIA roles and accessibility. This additional context will help us navigate React testing library in upcoming lessons. So first up, what is accessibility? Accessibility means designing our websites and applications to be capable of being used by as many people as possible, as many different users as possible. So users of our web application may not be able to use, for example, a mouse or a keyboard. They may be visually impaired, or they may have hearing impairments. And it's always a good idea, of course, to build our website and our business to be able to help and work for as many users as possible, right? So users may be using assistive technologies such as screen readers in order to navigate our website. A screen reader is just a device that informs the user what is available on the website. It's actually a device that can describe to a user, for example, that there is a menu of 3 items, each with a certain bit of text, and then the user can navigate it even if they can't visually see the interface that we have designed for them. And of course, there's simple tips and tricks and techniques that we can apply in our code to make our website work for all those users, not just the regular users, but users who may be using different devices to access our website. So as a very classic example of accessibility, I remember when I was first learning HTML and I learned about the image tag, I was always advised to add the alt attribute with a description of the image to the actual image element. And of course, the alt tag provides context to users who may have visual impairments. If they're unable to see the image, the alt tag obviously describes what is going on, right? But the alt tag also helps all users, right? Because if the image fails to load for some reason, like the server's down, well, now the user who cannot see the image has a written description of what is going on, and that may provide additional context which enhances their experience. So with that said, one additional aspect of accessibility that I want to talk about is ARIA roles. And the best way I can describe it is by actually reading an excerpt to you from the MDN website, the Mozilla Developer Network. So it says here, ARIA roles provide semantic meaning to content, allowing screen readers and other tools to present and support interaction with objects in a way that is consistent with user expectations of that type of object. That's a lot of technical jargon, so let me see if I can explain it to you in as simple terms as I can. The way I always like to think about it is I want to take a step back from being a front-end developer, and I want you to imagine that you are a user of a website who has no knowledge of coding or programming or React or JavaScript, right? Millions of people use websites every single day, and they have no knowledge of programming. So thus, they don't really care about whether a website is using React or another library like Angular or Vue, right? They don't really care about HTML elements like divs or spans or Ps, right? Those are all in our developer ecosystem. But for the end user, they care about what the website can do for them. So a user may not care about an input with a type of text, but a user might care about something like, hey, I want to find a text box on the page where I'm supposed to enter my email address so that I can log in to the app, right? So the purpose of a role is to describe the purpose of a piece of your UI or an element in your UI. I want to draw the distinction between an HTML element, which is a technical construct, and a role, which is a technical construct in the sense that we're going to code it into our HTML, but the difference is that it exists more for the benefit of the user. It describes the purpose of an element. It describes the purpose of a section of our UI. So for example, there is an available role called text box, and that is supposed to describe any kind of element that we can type text into. Now, for example, if we have an input with a type of text, that will automatically be assigned a role of text box by the browser, but they're different things. The HTML element is us as developers describing the interface, and the role is describing the purpose, the meaning, the significance of that context to a user. And that is helpful for things like screen readers because they can describe to a user what the value of something else is. Imagine you have a div that is serving as a button that the user is meant to click on, right? That's not ideal because you should be using a button, right? But just in case you have some kind of design that requires it to be a div, for a user using a screen reading device, a div means nothing to them, right? It's not an element that they are searching for or can understand, and a screen reader doesn't understand what a div is. It doesn't provide any semantic meaning for the purpose of it. But what we can do is add a role attribute to the div with a given role like button. There is a limited set of predefined roles that are available that we can assign to any element, and that will describe the purpose of that div. So for example, we can give the div a role of button, and that will communicate to a screen reader that this is something that is meant to be clicked by the user. The user understands a button that is meant to be clicked. They don't care about a div, right? So we're always focused on the perspective of the user and how they're going to be using the app, right? And that's the goal of a role. It's to describe the purpose of an element. It's a little bit confusing, and what makes it even more confusing is some HTML elements are going to be assigned automatic roles, and sometimes those roles are going to share names with elements. For example, there is a button role, which a button HTML element will have implicitly. As another example that I just mentioned, an input with a type of text will have a role of text box assigned to it automatically by the browser as well. And as we can see here in the second paragraph, it says, by default, many semantic elements in HTML have role. For example, an input with a type of radio will have a radio role. But there's also elements in HTML, such as divs and spans, that are not going to have a role, and that might create confusion for a screen reader, and it's our job to try to assist the screen reader and other users by providing context onto what certain parts of our UI are supposed to represent. And to do that, what we can do is add a role attribute that can provide those additional pieces of information. This is all very introductory, and so it's totally fine if it doesn't make perfect sense, but to summarize, what a role is an attribute that we can add to an element that is also sometimes implicitly added by the browser that describes the purpose for that element from the perspective of the user. This is a button. This is a text box, right? It's kind of related to the technical implementation, but it's supposed to be a little bit more agnostic. It should be a word that you can describe to a user to tell to a regular person with no knowledge of HTML that describes the value or the purpose of the element on that website. Now, if this is all brand new to you, one super cool thing is whenever you're on any website in a browser like Chrome, so here I have our app loaded, if you click into an element in the Elements Inspector, on the right-hand side, we have that separate panel where you're typically going to be taken to the styles that are being applied to that element. On that panel, there's a tab called Accessibility. You can see it selected here in the image. And if you go to that Accessibility tab, you're going to see this section called Computed Properties, and it's going to have a role property, and it's going to tell you the role of that element by default. So for example, this input that we have for the email address, which has a type of text, is automatically assigned a role of text box. And a text box is a sample role, right? It's describing the value. This is a box where the user enters text, right? That is something that the user can think about, can reason about. I want a box where I can enter text. The user doesn't care if it's input type of text, right? The user doesn't care if it's React or something else, but they do care about a text box where they can enter an email address. So the reason this all ties into React Testing Library is React Testing Library wants us to query our DOM nodes, query our interface from a perspective of users and roles. So for example, in the next lesson, we're going to look at a method that's going to find an element by its role, by its accessibility role, the purpose it's supposed to serve in the UI. So we're not going to be querying explicitly for an input HTML element with a type of text. We're going to be querying for an element with a type of a role, with a role of text box to be more specific. Because again, we are trying to write the test from the perspective of a user, and more specifically, any kind of user. A user who is visually capable of seeing a text box, or a user who is using a screen reader who will describe that the role of this thing is to serve as a text box where they can enter text, right? So we're trying to write our tests from a user-centric perspective that is describing what we're searching for from its purpose or its value in the UI without necessarily being super concerned about the technical implementation. The goal of React Testing Library is to test behavior rather than the specific implementation that we have. And we're going to see how this plays out in the methods that we explore on React Testing Library in the upcoming lessons. All right. But to summarize, Roles, or ARIA roles, describe the purpose of an element, and they tie into a greater theme in the front-end ecosystem of accessibility. Accessibility means making websites that are capable of being used and valued by as many users as possible, including users who may not be using traditional mouse and keyboards to access and navigate with your site. We want our website to be welcoming and to be able to be used by different types of devices, different types of users. A very simple, even example of accessibility, by the way, that I forgot to mention is responsiveness, right? If we have a website that is only going to work on desktop computers, but is not going to support users on mobile phones, well, that's eliminating a whole bunch of our audience, right? So that's why responsive design was created. It's partly due to accessibility, to make the app as capable of being used by as many users as possible. So we have ideas in HTML and CSS like breakpoints to help with that. And similarly, to assist users who might be using things like screen readers, we have this idea of roles, which helps associate an element with its given purpose in the UI. So hopefully I've given it a decent explanation. This is obviously not my forte, but hopefully that makes sense. And as we play around with React Testing Library, I hope you get a sense of how its principles and methodology play out in the methods that we're going to be invoking within it. So with that, I'll see you in the next lesson, where we'll dive back into VS Code and introduce you to the first method on the screen object and how it helps us query. All right, that's all there's to cover in this lesson. So I will see you in the next one.